How many of you use Evernote on a regular basis?
Wow.
It's pretty awesome. How many of you use the premium services? Okay, we have some work to do here, right? Some more. It's a growth opportunity. That's awesome. So, Phil, when Evernote first started, it was more about your desk drawer. It was, the drawer where you put everything and just forgot about it, and you could find whatever you wanted, whenever you wanted. And from there, it has really evolved, the vision for the product, where now you call it the workspace for your life's work, where you can write, collect, discuss, and present. So can you talk through that transition a little bit, and what does it mean for the product today?
Silicon Valley guys wouldn't come near us, but we had investment from Docomo and from a few other people who were actually just fans of the product, even early on. And when we started out, the way we tried to distinguish ourselves is we said Evernote isn't social. Like everything else back then was social. And we said Evernote isn't social. Evernote doesn't care about your friends. We don't care about your friend's dog. We just care about you and what's in your mind, and we want you to do substantive things in Evernote. And that was kind of the initial brand. And it evolved from that to basically saying, what do people want when they use Evernote? They want to be productive. So sometimes you want to you want to waste time, you want to connect, you want to be friendly, you want to be social, and that's perfectly good. And there's lots of things for that. But sometimes you just want to get something accomplished. You want to feel like you've made progress, and that's what we made Evernote for. And so that evolution went from using Evernote as basically just a big file cabinet to letting you do things in it that made you feel like you were accomplishing something important in your life. And as we got actually more and more into the collaborative uses in Evernote, that was our guiding principle, was that Evernote wasn't about collaborating, it wasn't about talking, it wasn't about actually connecting with anyone else, it was about getting something done, and very often you needed other people to help you get something done, and so in that case, we let you do it.
You want to talk about a couple of those use cases? Because I'm not sure if everyone knows how the product has evolved and if we are using it to its fullest capabilities.
Yeah, I think the most common thing I hear from users is that people say, "Oh, I love Evernote, but I'm only using like 5% of it." Like that is a very, very, very common thing. People feel that they're using only a small percentage of it, and in reality, they're not using 5%. They're probably using like 50%. But I think we've actually not done a great job in letting people intuitively understand kind of what the scope of the product is, what you can do with it. A lot of the feeling is that people are just scratching the surface in terms of its functionality. And that's kind of good and bad. Like it's nice that people feel like there's a lot more that they can do, but that means that people who aren't intrinsically motivated, who aren't completely motivated to just try to be productive, sometimes feel intimidated and will sometimes leave because they feel like they're not, they're really just scratching the surface, they don't really understand. So we are definitely trying to do a better job of feature discovery, of letting people just get a good sense for what can you do in Evernote. But what we wanted to do is we want you to be able to write in it. Basically, like you shouldn't be writing in Word. Like if you're writing in Word, you're doing it wrong. There's no reason to be writing in Word unless you're reviewing a legal contract with multiple levels of track changes or something like that. For functional writing, you shouldn't be writing in something that is pretending that you're going to print it out. Like if you're writing in most traditional tools, most of the UI is taken up by controls for fonts and margins and things that kind of look like paper, as if you were going to print it out, but you're not going to print it out. You're doing something else with it. When you write in Evernote, we wanted to improve the quality of your writing. So we want you to focus on the actual accuracy of the information you're writing. We want to show as you're writing what your coworkers know about the subject you're writing about, what news articles are relevant to what you're writing about. Instead of like focusing on the physical attributes of paper, we're focusing on the actual informational accuracy and correctness. And whatever you write in Evernote, we want you to be able to present it without having to like make separate slides and presentations. We want to have beautiful presentations directly from Evernote, and we want you to be able to discuss what you're doing. Our central product hypothesis is that an integrated experience of authoring and talking about what you're authoring is what's going to win in the market. And that's where the product is evolving to.
Let's go back a little bit, to the 2008, 2009 era when Rakesh invested in your company and you got some other venture money as well. I read that your original 2-year business forecast came within 5% 2 years later, which as an entrepreneur, you typically use the spreadsheet modeling capabilities to put in some growth rates that the VCs will invest in, but you really don't believe it. But clearly, you not only believed in it, you delivered against it. What kind of data did you have at that time, or what kind of forecasting capabilities did you have that enabled you to be that good at forecasting? Was it just serendipity, or there were some other drivers in the business that you just understood so well?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it definitely is, luck. Like we presented the plans, and people would ask a couple of years later if we were surprised by, how much Evernote has grown, and I would have to say, well, I couldn't be surprised because it's basically exactly what we told investors would happen.
Yeah.
But we never really believed it ourselves. I mean, we were surprised that it came true.
Okay. Well, thank you for being candid.
But I think what was working in our advantage at that point, and since then it's gotten a lot harder. Like our accuracy of forecasting has actually gotten significantly worse in the later years. But what was working for us back then was we had a fairly homogeneous user base. And we could track the behavior really well. So we did this cohort analysis where we basically said, this is what people do after the first week of using Evernote, after the first month, after the first 3 months, 12 months, and we can really see the cohort trends. And while we were getting users mostly of the same type, we were mostly getting people from iOS, App Store discovery, and desktop downloads, mostly in the U.S. and then starting in Japan and kind of developing countries. They were acting very similarly, and so we could run those models forward, and we got really accurate results. The whole point of Evernote was like there was nothing dramatic or fast about it. Like it wasn't meant to be a bursty product. It was meant to be the sort of thing that got more valuable the longer you used it. It took a few weeks of usage for it to actually sink in, to actually seem like it's a big deal. That limited its growth, but it made it much more predictable. So everything was sort of this like flywheel that just kind of picked up speed, and it wasn't accelerating very quickly, but it was constantly accelerating. And then as, a few years later, as we started getting into Android and we started getting into developing countries, and we just had, we did all sorts of preload deals and bundles, and we had radically different usage patterns. A lot of that early predictability became much, much harder, and we're just now getting better again at really understanding what's going on. So we went through maybe a 2 to 3 year period where we were really good, and then a 2 to 3 year period where it all got wobbly, and like now it's really tightening up again.
So, let's talk a little bit more about retention characteristics, right? Because you said if you use it enough, then the flywheel keeps going. In many of the businesses, let's say in Netflix, they claim that if you put at least 2 movies in a queue within your first X number of days, then they can predict your retention. Or Facebook would say that if you hit the Dunbar number in terms of the number of friends you had within a certain number of days, they could predict that you would be using Facebook a lot more. Were there any such things in your business, or are there such things today?
There are a few. There's definitely a few behaviors for us that correspond with much longer, much more valuable users. Interestingly, the strongest signal by far for us isn't actually which features you use, but it's what combination of devices you use.
Okay.
If you look at like our lifetime value or predicted lifetime value of a user, just based on observable revenue, by platform usage. And you just sort of normalize on somebody who just uses Android being like a 1. So let's just say someone who just uses Android is worth 1. Then someone who just uses iPhone is worth like maybe like 170. So like iPhone is, it's more valuable than Android. Someone who just uses us on a Windows desktop is worth like a 5. Someone who just uses us on a Mac is worth like maybe a 6. But someone who uses us on a phone and a desktop is worth like 20. So the biggest predictor by far of conversion, of retention, of all that stuff is basically usage on a phone and a desktop within the same month. And this was really kind of going back and forth. And one of the things that we're really interested about that we'll know in the next couple of months is how the wearables, how the Apple Watch and things like that really affect it. Our hypothesis is that it's another device that'll be heavily predictive. So the more places you use Evernote from, the more valuable you are, the more likely you are to stick around, the more likely you are to pay, the more likely you are to put a lot of stuff into it. And this is sort of intuitively correct, but to me it was very surprising how dramatic it is. That it's really like a 20x improvement by adding that second device.
So you talked a little bit about Japan earlier. You're a rock star in Japan. We kind of all know that. Or at least I know that.
I'm like a D or E level, minor tech celebrity in Japan.
Okay.
I get recognized in the street, but only by the wrong people. So.
Okay. All right. We won't ask who those wrong people are right now. But tell us a little bit about your Evernote's journey in Japan. And what did you learn? How has that influenced the way you've thought about the company, the culture, the way you manage the business?
Well, so Japan was the first country outside the U.S. that we really decided to put a lot of effort into. One of our first investments was from Docomo Capital, and it was because they already saw that we were starting to get some traction in Japan. So years and years ago, right? Like maybe a year after we started, we were sitting around looking at our data, and I thought that maybe we saw like a little, the line graph like bump up a little bit in Japan. I wasn't exactly sure. It may have just been like an artifact of how we scaled the graph, but like that was all the excuse I needed. I was like, oh look, we're doing great in Japan. We have to go there and figure out what's going on. So a bunch of us got on a plane to Japan, and we started hanging out, talking to bloggers. And Japan is a country that very much like has a positive feedback enthusiasm loop. Like Japan reciprocates enthusiasm. So like if you go there and you're excited, then you're visibly excited to be there and to be doing stuff. Then like the Japanese are super excited that you're excited, and then like you're excited that they're excited that you're excited, and then they get really excited. And there's this virtuous cycle that just builds up, and then it just goes, it kind of goes crazy.
It's like the AT&T commercial.
It is kind of like
you're
that.
Excited that I'm excited that you're excited.
Except like it works with Japan. It worked for us with Docomo, and we didn't change the product at all. All the conventional advice we got turned out to be wrong. Everyone told us like, oh, Japanese tastes are totally different from you can't have a product that's the same in the U.S. and Japan because Japanese people have radically different tastes, and Japanese companies are so difficult to deal with, and they take a long time, and like everything is going to be hard, and it all turned out to be false. Like Japan turns out to be the easiest place in the world for a Silicon Valley company, I think, to deal with, to do business with. The product was identical. The companies were super easy to deal with. Even the big ones are just forthright and honest and direct, and it takes a few conversations to get anywhere, but it does that everywhere. Plus, in Japan, those conversations, a large percentage of them, you're out drinking, so it's better. But then this experience from Japan really informed our approach to the rest of the world, and it turned out that it's kind of the same everywhere. Like almost everyone reciprocates enthusiasm, and almost every country wants to be treated the same as the rest of the world. And we just started doing that everywhere, and that's been working really well.
So, I had a similar experience when I was managing international products at Google with respect to Asian countries, where everyone would say, intuitively, you need to build something different. And we found that the base products worked exceedingly well. How, as you do product development, how much intuition do you use versus data and user feedback? And how does that loop play in the way you think about product strategy?
Well, so I think you kind of go through three stages of how much user feedback you're getting, like about how much customer feedback you get about your product. Like at first, you're just not getting nearly enough. And then you go through a period where you're getting just the right amount of user feedback. And then you go through a period where you're getting way too much user feedback. Really, of course I'm kidding. There's no phase two. There's no just enough. You just go directly from like, I don't know what people think to like, I'm getting far more feedback than I can possibly use. And it's important, like we've realized what user feedback is good for and what it's not good for. And I think what it's really good for is, it's good for telling you what you screwed up. Like people are naturally gifted at complaining. They don't need a whole lot of encouragement or training in how to do it. And so like the torrent of user feedback that's useful is the complaints. And you have to, we look at all of them. We try to sort of de-emotionalize things. Like we get death threats over fairly minor things.
Really?
Oh yeah.
No.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, well, like the first, I made a video right when on the day we launched Evernote into our open beta in 2008. I was up the night before. We were going to launch the next morning. It was like 3 a.m. And I realized we didn't have a video. And I'm like, we should like make a little product video to put on the website. So I just made a video of myself, narrating the screenshots at 3 a.m. and we put it up on the site. Had like millions of views. And the first comment on this video was, whoever does the voiceover at this video ought to be found and beaten to death. And I was like, I disagree.
But did you own up that you did the voiceover?
But no, I did the voiceover, but it had like a valid point. Like the voiceover kind of sucked. And and we actually went and got someone who knows how to do voiceover, and we actually invested in a microphone, and it was a lot better. And so like there was an important kernel of truth in that user feedback.
Yeah.
It's just like there they accurately diagnosed the problem, but their recommended remedy was, I think, extreme.
Okay.
And that happens a lot with user feedback. And so you have to embrace it. You have to be like, you just have to embrace all that stuff. What's not useful for user feedback are usually praise. Like praise kind of gets you confused and distracted. It's nice, you can sort of share it with the team, but you like focus too much on the praise and you just go into a weird direction. And suggestions for what you should be building. So the user feedback tells you what you're doing wrong. Your designers tell you what you should be doing next. And then hopefully the combination of those actually results in an iteratively better product.
And so where does data play a role in the way you build products?
Increasingly more and more. So it used to play very little role for us. For the first few years, it was all like just intuition. So we would get qualitative feedback and try to figure out what that meant, and then we would just make decisions ourselves. And over the past couple of years, we've said much more like there are many topics on which our opinions don't matter because there's data out there, and so we've started instrumenting many more things. So like we recently launched, just a week ago, I think we launched the first time ever, we changed our whole pricing tiers and what we call the products and how we market it. And we hadn't touched that in about 8 years, and we just changed it all. And that was the first big project that we ran. It took us about 9 months to launch that, and it was extremely data-driven. Like we did multiple rounds of different types of surveys and tests and A/B testing to kind of get to the right answers. And in that process, in that 9-month process, multiple times I found like my strong intuition being just not supported by data, just proven wrong. Like all over and over and over again, there would be things that I was like, oh, it's going to be this, and then we would get the results back, and it was like my intuition was like the worst thing we could do. And that was like such a liberating experience. And we finally launched it, and it's doing great. And it's a really liberating experience to know that like for certain important elements of the business, I don't have to be right. Like it doesn't matter what I think because it's just empirically discoverable. Like that's awesome. It's like it's such a relief, like to know like, oh, you know what? I don't have to like form opinions about all sorts of things. I can just like figure it out. But for long-term product strategy, I think that's still very much just based on the the vision and the intuition. So at this point, it's maybe a lot of the things that we can optimize, we do. Maybe 50%, maybe 60% of the work that we do is the direct result of empirical data. More and more, that's happening live. Like we're building frameworks that automatically adjust based on performance. But most of that is kind of around the edges. The core, like what are we building? The core features is still very much just up to me and the designers and the rest of the employees.
Yeah, talking about intuition and how that informs product strategy, there's a interesting question from the audience about how you feel about Slack, because Slack is, one would say, maybe the third or fourth incarnation of a product like that, right? There was Google Waze back in the day, and then there was Yammer and Chatter, which is still around, and then Slack comes in and suddenly is the talk of the town, and you have collaborative features in Evernote as well. So how do you think about that space, and does it jive with your intuition in terms of how well they're doing?
Yeah, and Evernote was like the 12th iteration of that kind of product idea. Like It's not, we were like, how did you come up with Evernote? And like, man, Evernote is like the least innovative idea in technology. We were going to use computers to help you write things down and remember things. Like that was the idea.
Yeah,
like, that's not super original. I think Rakesh remember our first VC pitch. We really had a terrible pitch. When we would get asked, like, so what's your competition? I would say, well, every single computer or phone or PDA that's ever been released already has a free, pretty good note-taking app on it. So that's our competition. It wasn't a great answer.
And you still got money.
Still got money.
That's pretty awesome.
So I think like the making something that's just slightly better is the way that you move forward. And then at some point, somebody makes something that's slightly better enough to sort of tip it into the mainstream. And I think Slack did that. And I think Evernote did that for what we did. I think Slack did it. I think Slack's a really good product. We had been using it internally a lot. As we're building our own collaborative features, we are trying to reduce our dependence on Slack just because we want to use our own stuff more. At a high level, I think Slack is the last example of the old metaphor. I think one of the reasons they're so successful, I mean, the main reason is just it's a good product. It's got a good vibe to it. Like, it's interesting that it's called Slack, right? It's used entirely for business, but it's called Slack. Like, it's not called, tight.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's basically the opposite. Like it's called like Slack is a euphemism for just like not actually doing any work, but you're using it for work. Like there's all sorts of really interesting psychology that's kind of brilliant. Whether it's intentional or accidental, it's still brilliant. But it's the old metaphor. So the old metaphor is you write in Microsoft Word, and you store it in Dropbox, and you talk about it in email or Slack. And I think that really works. That works really well on the desktop when you can alt tab between different apps, and you can cut and paste URLs, and you can do that stuff. I don't think it works on mobile. And I think it ridiculously doesn't even begin to make sense in a world with wearables. So I think like Slack is very successful because they build a beautiful product that fits into the old paradigm that people understand, but the paradigms are changing. I think what we're building is the way that things have to go in the future, which doesn't mean that we'll be successful because somebody may build our paradigm better, but I think it has to be this paradigm of having a integrated experience where you don't write in Word and store in Dropbox and talk in Slack. You do all of that in an integrated way across all of your devices.
Okay, cool. We'll have Stuart here next year, and then we can do a face-off of some sort.
I think I'm talking with Stuart in some panel, I think, in a week or two. So.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah. I've never met him. Looking forward to it.
Yeah. So this is a panel about data, but we have time for one last question, and I'm going to ask a question which is completely on the opposite spectrum of data. And I know recently you gave a talk on the meaning of life. So tell us, what is the meaning of life in 2 minutes or less?
I did give a talk about it. It was in the middle of the desert, and it was in costume, so it's not necessarily
but it wasn't Burning Man.
It wasn't Burning Man, but it was like a Burning Man spin-off or something, kind of. So I think.
And what was your costume?
My costume was very good. There's no photographic evidence of it, but it was very. it was quite nice. It was my first time wearing costume. Anyway. Look, I think a lot of you probably read The Hitchhiker's Guide, right? Douglas Adams' book, and there's a thing where the meaning of life is 42, and I think this is like, I think Douglas Adams did this like huge disservice to the world by joking about it. Like it's very funny, but it sort of gives this impression that the meaning of life is something that you can't actually take seriously. Like there has to be a joke answer because it's such a big thing that you couldn't possibly approach it seriously. And bullshit, you kind of can't. Like it is an important big thing that you actually can think about and you can take seriously. But it isn't a two-word answer. It isn't necessarily a tweet. At least I can't make it a tweet. It takes a little bit more discussion to do. But ultimately, I do think that it is important to have a cogent philosophy of life that explains like why you're here and why you're working so hard building what you're trying to build, assuming you're working hard. And I think it's actually possible to think through it and to have a compelling explanation. So we'll see if they ever post the video of my talk. We can share it.
But so what is your meaning of life?
Well, it's basically
what is the goal?
it's basically intentional hard work to allow culture and civilization to transcend the next tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of years of risks that would otherwise threaten life and intelligence and civilization. It really takes more than 2 minutes to answer this. It's an exceptionally well thought through and poignant explanation, but it takes like 22 minutes, not two.
All right.
I've thought of a wonderful meaning of life, but there's not enough room to write it in this margin.
Okay. So with that teaser and the trailer, so next time maybe we'll have you give a full talk on the meaning of life. Ladies and gentlemen, Phil Libin.
Thank you.
Thank you.